This video is generously sponsored by Decca Classics. On April 25th, 2025, Carnegie Hall was the scene of a truly modern spectacle. Over 2,700 eager patrons filled this venue to hear 21-year-old star pianist Yunshan Lim play variations on this bass line for 80 minutes straight. Over a century ago, such enthusiasm for a young pianist playing Bach's Goldberg Variations would have seemed highly unlikely. Few pianists played it, and few audiences wanted to hear it in its entirety. As late as 1915, the Italian pianist and composer Busoni wrote about rescuing this remarkable work for the concert hall. To do so, he suggested cutting nearly a third of the variations and playing without repeats to reduce listener fatigue, a tactic also endorsed a few years earlier by Carl Klindworth, a former Liszt pupil. But length was only part of the challenge. Bach's score expressly called for a double manual harpsichord, an instrument that practically went extinct within decades of the composer's death. The harpsichord's two manuals facilitated many intricate passages with interweaving voices, something that didn't translate easily to the piano's single keyboard. It was for this reason that Josef Rheinberger wrote in 1883 that the Goldberg Variations were only known to pianists in theory. Rheinberger thought it necessary to arrange the variations for two pianos to make them more accessible for pianists. This had already been done more than 70 years earlier, in 1810, when a private performance of the Goldbergs, arranged for two pianos, took place in the home of Charles Burney. Documented performances of the variations in the 19th century are scarcely known today. Even if plenty of pianists were studying Bach in those days, they were evidently choosing not to play the formidable Goldberg Variations in public. But that couldn't be further from today's reality. The Goldberg Variations had become a rite of passage for serious keyboard artists, including Yunshan Lim. 2 years after becoming the youngest ever gold medalist of the prestigious Clyburn competition at 18 years old, Lim made an award-winning recording of Chopin's Etudes and has amassed over 18 million YouTube views so far on his Clyburn performance of Rock 3. Now, at the age of 21, he joins an exclusive list of pianists who have recorded Bach's complete Goldberg Variations in their late teens or early 20s. Despite his young age, Lim gives a performance full of emotional maturity. It's telling that Yunshan pre-released a clip on YouTube of the somber 15th variation. This sighing canon at the 5th is one of only 3 minor key variations in the whole set of 30, making it a crucial moment of reflection midway through the performance. This canon at the 5th only requires one keyboard, but Bach prescribed the use of 2 keyboards in 14 out of the 30 Goldberg variations. So how do modern pianists like Yunshan Lim manage to play the entire work? Bach utilized the double harpsichord's expanded resources in 3 main ways: dynamics, color, and texture. Australian harpsichordist Aaron Helliyard's tour of a double harpsichord explains the range of dynamics and colors Bach's intended instrument could achieve.
We have the lower manual has a beautiful belly sound, and then this one has a slightly tartar, more nasal sound. So if I push this draw in now, both of those strings are being performed at once, and you see that I can't play that one now because it's actually going down on the top manual as well, and I've got a little bit more sound, more sonority. I also can add another set of strings by pushing this lever on the right, and that adds, so now 3 strings. Finally, another effect that I have on this instrument is what's called the buff stop, and that creates a beautiful effect that we call, it's buff or leather goes against the strings, and it creates something like a harp or a lute.
While these sounds are unique to the double harpsichord, they're not too hard to translate onto the piano, which can achieve a wide range of volume and various tones through the player's touch. The more problematic one is texture, specifically Bach's use of polyphonic voices that frequently cross each other's paths and double on certain notes, as in Variation 11. But playing this same variation on the piano immediately presents a challenge, as Hilliard demonstrates.
This happens in the very first bar. I'm already playing this note, so I can't play it again.
This difficulty is what pianist and Bach specialist Andras Schiff calls
a traffic jam.
There are ways around these traffic jams, as Schiff explains.
Then you have to work out a method how to put one hand over the other one or under the other one and work out fingerings that the two hands don't get into each other's way.
While it's not quite as easy as he makes it sound, you can see how Schiff utilizes two different planes of motion while executing close quarters variations like number 20. This is the same technique used to even more spectacular effect by Sokolov in another piece for double manual harpsichord, Couperin's Le Tic-Toc-Choc. The Goldberg Variations were not Bach's only work for double harpsichord. He wrote the Italian Concerto and French Overture for the same instrument, and these works are commonly played on the piano. But Bach's writing in these works is more focused on exploiting the color and dynamics of the instrument's two keyboards, whereas the frequently interweaving voices found in the Goldbergs require some compromises.
You either have to play quite lightly, like Glenn Gould did, and you can't play the legato lines that I think it needs, or you somehow use the pedal to sustain some of the notes, or you have to change the ornaments, like here. You make them shorter. Some pianists even go further and they avoid the crossing of the hands and rewrite it.
So any pianist wanting to play this work must not only put up with the technical difficulties of translating from two keyboards to one, but must also be comfortable with making creative decisions that go against Bach's written intent. Still, the technical and artistic challenges of playing this work on a single manual instrument can only partly explain the long absence of the Goldberg Variations from the concert platform. From its earliest days, the work seemed destined for private enrichment rather than public display. There's currently no known documentation of an 18th century performance of the Goldbergs on any instrument except for a doubtful one from Bach's first biographer, Forkel. He wrote that the variations were composed for Bach's former student, Johann Gottlieb Goldberg, to play for his employer, Count Kaiserlink of Dresden, who needed lively music to cheer him up on sleepless nights. But Bach scholars like Christoph Wolff doubt this story, since Bach clearly intended the variations as the fourth part of his Klavierübung, a comprehensive series of keyboard works. Scholar Peter Williams suggests that Bach simply brought the Count a signed copy of his newly published variations during his visit to Dresden in 1741. After all, Goldberg was just 14 years old, so unless he was a prodigy of Yunshan Lim's caliber, he probably couldn't have managed to play the whole set right away. With all that said, Bach's musical reason for writing the variations is much more clear. According to Christoph Wolff, the composer wanted to show what was possible at the keyboard in terms of technical development, virtuosic finesse, and compositional sophistication. Wolff believes that Bach was inspired by Handel's earlier set of 64 variations on a shorter 8-bar version of the aria bass. Bach must have liked the ground bass's potential, so he expanded it to 32 bars and made it the capstone of his instructional and artistic Klavierübung collection, a monumental series that includes most of Bach's solo keyboard masterworks. This ground bass is what distinguishes the Goldberg Variations from later sets like Beethoven's Diabelli Variations, which have a principal theme rather than a fundamental line as their basis. Upon these 32 notes, Bach presents a world of ideas in 32 parts. The aria, an expressive and highly embellished saraband, appears at the beginning and the end, bookending 30 variations, which are divided into virtuosic toccatas, various dances, and contrapuntal forms. Every third variation is punctuated by a canon, in which a melody is played with an echo of itself. Each of these canons is built on an increasingly wide interval, from perfect unison to an entire ninth apart. Bach skillfully spun wonderful music out of these canons so that the unknowing listener can easily forget that they follow a strict formula at all. In the 30th variation, Bach breaks this cycle by introducing a so-called quodlibet, a polyphonic mashup of two popular songs played above the ground bass. Bach conceived the Goldberg Variations with a clear architecture that rewards those who study it and play it through from end to end. But whether this work was heard by audiences as a complete cycle in its early history is another question. Solo keyboard works of this length were not commonly performed in public until the later 19th and early 20th centuries. 19th century concert programming for the general public focused on variety, not in the sense of an hour-long variation set, but in the free mixture of fantasies, popular arias, overtures, single movements taken from larger works, duets, and paraphrases of theatrical works like operas. By the end of the century, these lighter tastes had begun giving way to the modern focus on large, multi-movement works that demanded concentration throughout, with applause held until the end. This end-focused view emphasized longer works as a complete unit or a cycle, rather than a loose collection of pieces to be played selectively at will. But this reverential treatment was often too much to ask of most non-specialized audiences in the first half of the 19th century. A long variation set like the Goldbergs would have been a tough sell for recital goers, just as Beethoven's hour-long Diabelli Variations were received with little critical enthusiasm as late as 1876, when Hans von Bülow performed them in New York. And while the reported early performance of the Goldbergs in the home of music historian Charles Burney in 1810 is evidence that specialists did at least engage with this music in private, it wasn't without its challenges. For the same technical reasons discussed earlier in this video, the performance was arranged for two pianos, and even then, Burney suggested splitting the performance into 3 parts, with breaks in between due to its length. But the performers refused to do this and instead played it straight through, followed by a discussion of the work. This performance benefited from a sympathetic audience of musicians and connoisseurs in a formally organized setting, but an informal private hearing of the complete variations would have been out of the question in many other cases. Showing up to an 1810s party, for instance, with the Goldbergs under your arm rather than a set of light variations or waltzes would have been an unpopular move. This is exactly what happened in an 1810 essay by E.T.A. Hoffmann. Chrysler, who was Hoffmann's fictional take on a tortured and misunderstood composer, plays the Goldberg Variations for a private party who are expecting to hear variations in the style of Mozart. Instead, they get 80 minutes of Bach. One by one, the party members leave in boredom, with only one inebriated auditor left by Variation 30. Curiously, the story would repeat in real life 111 years later. The 17-year-old Rudolf Serkin had just finished his Berlin debut recital in 1921 when the concert organizer, Adolf Busch, jokingly told him to play the Goldberg Variations as an encore. Serkin took him seriously, and by the time he finished, there were only 3 people left in the audience: Busch himself, the pianist Arthur Schnabel, and the musicologist Alfred Einstein. To be fair, the unwitting audience had not signed up for such a colossal dessert. But even planned performances of the Goldbergs met with resistance from performers and audiences alike. Recognizing this difficulty, some late 19th century musicians rearranged Bach's Goldberg Variations to make them more palatable. In Josef Rheinberger's two-piano version of 1883, the pianists trade off virtuosic excerpts without needing to worry about those awkward hand crossings. But the arrangement goes well beyond Bach's score. One player takes the bass material while the other simultaneously riffs on top of it, creating richer sonorities and thematic interplay. Ironically, Rheinberger's attempt to make the piece more accessible was in vain, since it required having two pianos in the same room. To improve upon this, Carl Eichler made a piano four-hands arrangement of the Goldberg Variations in 1911. Eichler thought Rheinberger's setting was too virtuosic and difficult for pianists of moderate technique to play or study, so he simplified the material by dividing it between four hands, citing the contemporary scholarly belief that most of the ornaments were not Bach's own, but rather the work of ambitious copyists. Eichler omitted many of the characteristic embellishments, leaving the aria sounding like a weird skeletal version of itself. But even these alterations to Bach's Goldbergs paled in comparison to Busoni's. The preface to his 1914 concert version for solo piano reads, "In order to rescue this remarkable work for the concert hall, it is necessary to render it more suitable for both the receptive powers of the hearer and for the possibilities of the performer." In other words, he's saying audiences need to be spoon-fed their vegetables, Bach's great music. So the pianist needs to chop off the parts that are harder to swallow and cover it up with some kind of delicious sauce to make it more enjoyable for them. To accomplish this, Busoni suggested disregarding the repeat marks and suppressing several of the variations. For instance, he writes, "The character of the third variation, which makes great demands on a thorough mastery of touch, is sufficiently expressed in the second variation, so that the omission of the third need hardly be considered a loss," and so on. All in all, Busoni removed 9 of the variations, most of them contrapuntal, to make the full performance last around 30 minutes without repeats. He freely added pianistic octaves where he saw fit. He wrote anachronistic editorial markings like quasi-trombe and kräftig, or for those who don't read German, robustamente. He even suggested linking certain pieces by playing them attacca for a different structural feel. He turned the final allegro into something more like a perpetuum mobile and transformed the concluding aria da capo into an indulgent chorale with profound octaves added to the bass. In 1914, Busoni performed this recomposed version of the Goldberg Variations to a full house in Berlin. The reviewer wrote, "The Goldberg Variations would probably have frightened many without the prospect of hearing them in the new Busonian arrangement. Now that Busoni has played these dreaded variations, one has to admit that they're actually quite different from listening to them on two pianos or trying to play them on one's own." It is doubtful whether Count von Kaiserling's melancholy really waned when the young Goldberg played the variations for him, some of which are and remain boring. On the other hand, the great beauty of individual variations stands out more clearly, such as in the 25th, which was performed by Busoni with touching tenderness, the 28th with a play on Beethoven's Opus 109, the Beethoven-esque 29th variation, and the very exquisite Quodlibet. While Busoni's arrangement might have helped popularize the work, it says a lot more about Busoni himself than it reveals about Bach's original intent. But another movement around the turn of the century emphasized more reliance on the original score and instrument. Musicologist Alfred Hipkins performed the Goldbergs on a double manual harpsichord in London during the 1880s and 90s. Harold Samuel, an early Bach specialist, played it on the piano for a general London audience in his 1898 debut recital. According to Harold Schoenberg, Samuel's playing of Bach reflected the modern style in its lack of elaborate, Busoni-like ritardandos, in its strict adherence to the text, and in its rhythmic steadiness. Another musicologist and pianist, Donald Francis Tovey, performed the variations privately on a piano in 1904 and later wrote an essay insisting that the notes be played exactly as written. As the 20th century wore on, there was a revival in harpsichord construction, some more authentic than others. Wanda Landowska's historic 1933 harpsichord performance became the first commercial recording of the Goldbergs. Her powerful and colorful interpretation kicked off a revival of harpsichord performances, even though the Pleyel instrument she played was constructed with a modern frame. Between 1928 and 1947, 6 recordings of the Goldberg Variations were created, 4 of them on the piano. Despite the earlier attempts, Rosalind Turek's 1947 recording became the first piano performance of the Goldbergs to be commercially released, influencing many later performers. One of those was Glenn Gould, whose iconic 1955 recording, his debut album at 22 years old, added youthful brilliance, energy, and his characteristic singing to the mix. 70 years later, it still sounds wildly original and continues to fuel debates about modern Bach interpretations. Like Busoni, Gould skipped the repeats and often pushed the tempo outside of its traditional bounds, but he stopped short of fundamentally changing the structure of the work. Before Gould's, there were about a dozen recordings of the Goldbergs in existence, but by the end of the century, nearly 300 live, home, or studio recordings had been created or re-released, played by pianists, harpsichordists, and even organists. Many of these were influenced by the startling 1974 rediscovery of Bach's handwritten corrections to the first edition. This rare document shows Bach's meticulous correction of minor misprints, his addition of missing flats and sharps and key signatures, added accidentals to improve modulations, slurs and staccato dots to clarify articulation, tempo markings to confirm the characters of certain variations, and new ornaments. Sometime between 1742 and 1746, Bach further expanded upon his already exhaustive variations through a series of 14 additional canons upon the first 8 notes of the ground bass. Some of these were among the most theoretically complex Bach ever wrote, and incredibly, he ended the page by writing etc., as if to imply an unending continuation of this exercise. Just as Bach pointed toward an infinite number of approaches to the material, modern performances of the Goldbergs show no signs of slowing down.
The Goldberg Variations, which I think is history's greatest keyboard work, the encyclopedia how you can think and dream on the keyboard.
This incredible explosion in Goldberg performances led to what we witness today, a rising star like Yunchan Lim making a bold early career statement by playing the Goldberg Variations live on the piano in their original form for a packed audience that remains captive from beginning to end with repeats. And that brings us to the most obvious reason why pianists play Bach's Goldberg Variations today.
Is it right to play Bach on the piano? For heaven's sake, this is the greatest composer of all times, and this music is way beyond instruments.
Schiff's attitude is a modern one, a fact we have to remember when we imagine the ideal performance looking anything like this. While modern concert culture has made audiences much more willing to sit in reverential silence throughout the 80-minute set of Bach's Variations, and it's allowed for the work's performance on an instrument that barely resembles the one Bach wrote it on, it has also drawn certain boundaries. Bach's original text is generally more highly valued than free adaptations like Busoni's. Also, Schiff defends the Goldbergs being performed on a piano, but he criticizes arrangements for chamber ensembles, insisting that this music must be played by a soloist.
This is a solo piece. This is meant to be for one player and not for a group of people. This should not be played by an ensemble.
The question of where we should draw that line continues with the modern revival of Busoni's Goldberg Variations. Pianist Ming Aldrich Gahn, who performed his own free adaptation of Busoni's arrangement, argued that the evolution of a piece does not stop with the death of the composer. He defended Busoni's version with the question, what if Bach had lived to see the piano evolve into what it is today? It's a tantalizing question that is impossible for us to answer. But modern performances aren't programmed for Bach himself to enjoy. They're for us. So whoever your preferred interpreter of the Goldberg Variations may be, whichever edition they use, whatever instrument they play, and how and where and why, consider what all of that says about your values as a 21st century listener. And if you're up for it, imagine how audiences 50 or 100 years from now might think otherwise.